My parents left me $1, while my sister got 2.4 million. After my dad passed, I finally learned why. That's the number, one measly dollar. Not a typo, not a joke, not even a symbolic gesture, just a single solitary dollar bill, folded neatly and placed in a small cream-colored envelope addressed to me, Olivia Vance, in my mother's familiar, elegant cursive. It sat on the polished mahogany desk in my father's study, a room that had always felt like a sanctuary, a place of quiet power and unwavering certainty. Now, it just felt cold. I remember staring at it for what felt like an eternity, the scent of old leather and pipe tobacco suddenly suffocating. My sister, Claire, stood a few feet away, clutching a document that looked impossibly official, her eyes wide, not with sorrow, but with a kind of dazed triumph. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, a man I'd known my whole life, cleared his throat, his gaze flicking between us with a practiced professional discomfort. He just finished reading aloud the terms of my father's will, the meticulous accounting of a life well lived, a legacy built from scratch into an empire that touched everything from real estate development to tech startups. And then he'd landed on my name, $1. Claire, on the other hand, was to receive the bulk of it, $2.4 million, a tidy sum that would set her up for life, no questions asked. The rest, a substantial portion, was earmarked for various charities, and a smaller but still significant portion for my mother. But me? Olivia? The one who'd always been the dutiful one, the quiet observer, the one who'd sacrificed her own ambitions to keep the Vance family ship steady when Dad was ill? $1. The silence in that room stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a steady, relentless march of time that suddenly felt indifferent to my personal devastation. Claire's mouth was slightly agape, as if even she hadn't expected such a stark contrast, though her expression quickly smoothed into something I couldn't quite decipher. Pity? Guilt? Triumph? It was hard to tell. My mother, bless her heart, looked genuinely distraught. She reached out a hand towards me, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Olivia, darling, I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your father loved you so much." Love. That's what it came down to, didn't it? Love. And apparently, love in my father's final accounting was worth precisely $1. The immediate aftermath was a blur of forced smiles and hushed condolences. People who'd known me my whole life, who'd watched me grow up, who'd seen me tirelessly support my parents through every crisis, suddenly averted their eyes. The whispers started before I'd even left the house. Can you believe it? Poor Olivia. She must have done something terrible. The family gatherings, once warm and boisterous, transformed into a minefield of awkward silences and sideways glances. Thanksgiving was a particular kind of hell. Aunt Carol, who'd always coddled me, now patted my hand with an unnerving sympathy that felt more like an accusation. Uncle Bill, normally so jovial, just kept shaking his head, muttering about unforeseen circumstances. Claire, meanwhile, was radiant. She'd bought a new condo in the city, started talking about traveling, and her laughter, once familiar, now seemed to echo with a new, unsettling confidence. She'd even started dropping hints about how much she owed Dad for his foresight, as if she'd somehow earned this windfall through sheer merit. I withdrew. What else could I do? Every interaction felt like a performance, a carefully constructed facade to hide the raw, gaping wound inside me. I stopped answering calls from people I used to consider friends. My job at the law firm, a career I'd poured my heart into, became a refuge, a place where the only judgment was based on legal precedent, not familial betrayal. But even there, the whispers followed. People knew. News like that travels faster than wildfire in our circles. I'd catch snippets of conversations, muffled laughter, the quick cessation of chatter when I walked by. It was like being an exhibit in a bizarre, morbid museum. Exhibit A, the daughter who got pennies. My mother tried. She really did. She'd call, her voice laced with that same desperate confusion. "Olivia, honey, we need to talk. Your father, he was a complex man. Maybe there's something we're missing." But I couldn't. Not then. The anger was a living, breathing thing inside me, a hot, acrid poison that I couldn't yet bring myself to examine. It was easier to let it fester, to let it consume me, than to confront the gnawing realization that the man I'd worshipped, the man I'd idolized, had somehow deemed me less worthy than my sister by an astronomical margin, less worthy of security, of comfort, of a future. The estate was a sprawling testament to Dad's success. acres of manicured lawns, a sprawling house that felt more like a museum than a home, and enough antiques to fill several galleries. It was the place where my most cherished childhood memories were made. Summer barbecues on the sprawling patio, Christmas mornings by the massive fireplace, Dad teaching me how to ride a bike on the long winding driveway. Now, it just felt like a monument to my exclusion. Claire and Mom were in the process of dividing things, sorting through heirlooms, deciding what to keep, what to sell. They'd invited me to help, a hollow gesture of inclusion that felt more like an obligation. I'd gone once, the air thick with unspoken tension. Claire was already talking about renovating the master suite, painting the walls a stark white, a stark contrast to Dad's rich, dark wood paneling. It felt like an erasure. During that visit, I wandered into my father's study again, drawn by some morbid curiosity. The desk was cleared, meticulously organized, but the faint scent of his presence lingered. I ran my hand over the smooth surface, remembering him sitting there, his brow furrowed in concentration, his voice calm and steady as he explained complex financial reports to me, even when I was just a teenager. He'd always treated me like an equal, like someone whose opinion mattered. He taught me the value of hard work, the importance of integrity, the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful. And then he'd left me $1. Tucked away in a small lacquered box on a lower shelf, I found it. A single thin folder, labeled simply, Olivia, private. My heart hammered against my ribs. This, I thought, this had to be it. The explanation, the reason. My fingers fumbled with the latch, the wood cool against my skin. Inside, there weren't soaring declarations of love or heartfelt apologies. Instead, there were documents, legal documents, bank statements, investment portfolios. And a series of letters not addressed to me, but to my father. They were from Claire, dating back years. The initial shock was a physical blow. It felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Claire, my sister, the one who'd always seemed so sweet, so dependent, she'd been orchestrating this, slowly, meticulously, over years. I read, my vision blurring with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, chilling understanding. The loans she'd taken from Dad's personal accounts, initially presented as short-term financial assistance, the increasingly insistent requests for investment opportunities that Dad, ever the benevolent patriarch, had apparently provided. The documents detailed how she'd leveraged these funds, how she'd manipulated market fluctuations, how she'd slowly, subtly amassed her own fortune under the guise of needing Dad's help. She hadn't just been given money, she'd been given the keys to Dad's financial empire, a silent, insidious takeover that he, for reasons I couldn't fathom, had allowed. There were also records of my own financial dealings, small, discrete sums I'd borrowed over the years to help with my education, to buy my first car, to help Mom with household expenses when Dad was recovering from surgery. Each transaction was meticulously documented, each repayment tracked. And then, nestled amongst the papers, a note from my father, dated just a few months before he passed. It was brief, almost perfunctory. Olivia, it read, your sister has always been ambitious. I believe in fostering independence. You, my dear, have always been my rock, my steady hand. Sometimes the greatest gift is not what you are given, but what you learn to build yourself. You have the strength within you. Do not underestimate it. Strength, independence, build yourself. The words felt like ashes in my mouth. Was this his twisted way of empowering me by leaving me with nothing, forcing me to scramble to rely solely on my own abilities? Or was it something darker? A calculated move, perhaps influenced by Claire, to ensure I wouldn't compete with her newfound wealth. The idea was sickening. The more I read, the more the carefully constructed image of my father began to crumble. He wasn't just a loving father who'd made a strange decision. He was a participant in Claire's elaborate scheme, a silent accomplice to my financial emasculation. The sheer audacity of it, the quiet deception, the years of manipulation, it was breathtaking. And Claire, my sister, the person I'd shared scraped knees with, secrets with, dreams with, she hadn't just taken the money, she'd actively worked to diminish my claim, to ensure my legacy was one of insignificance.
The venom in her carefully worded requests for funds, the veiled criticisms of my own financial prudence in her letters to Dad, it all clicked into place. She hadn't just wanted the money, she'd wanted to win. She'd wanted to be the successful one, the favorite one, and she'd used her father's blind spot, his desire to see her thrive, to achieve it. The dollar bill on the desk suddenly felt less like an insult and more like a taunt, a sardonic punchline to a decades-long con. I sat there for a long time, the weight of the revelations pressing down on me. The familiar study, once a place of comfort, now felt like the scene of a crime. The scent of old leather was now tainted with the smell of betrayal. My carefully cultivated stoicism began to fracture.
The humiliation of the past few weeks, the whispers, the averted gazes, they coalesced into something sharp and potent. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the years of subtle control, the hidden manipulation, the fundamental lie at the heart of my family. My father, the man I trusted implicitly, had been a party to this, and Claire, my own sister, had orchestrated it. The anger that had been simmering for weeks erupted, a silent inferno that threatened to consume me. I closed the folder, my hands trembling, not with sadness, but with a cold, hard resolve. The game had changed, the rules had changed, and I was no longer Olivia Vance, the recipient of a single dollar. I was Olivia Vance, the one who finally knew the truth. And the truth, I was beginning to understand, was a far more powerful currency than any amount of money. I looked at the empty envelope on the desk, the one that had held my meager inheritance. It was time to start building, but not the way my father had intended. My building would be of a different sort entirely. It would be built on the ruins of their deception, brick by painstaking brick. The silence of the study was no longer suffocating. It was a promise of what was to come. And the grandfather clock chimed, marking not the passage of time, but the dawn of something new, something dangerous. The silence of the study was no longer suffocating. It was a promise of what was to come. And the grandfather clock chimed, marking not the passage of time, but the dawn of something new, something dangerous. I stayed in that room for hours, the folded documents a heavy weight in my lap, the late afternoon sun casting long, accusing shadows across the polished floorboards. The initial shock had morphed into a glacial calm, a terrifying stillness that settled over me like a shroud. My father's note, the one about building myself, echoed in my mind, but now it sounded less like encouragement and more like a dare. He'd always underestimated me, hadn't he? He'd seen me as the steady one, the responsible one, the one who'd always fall in line. He'd never imagined I'd dig. He'd never imagined I'd find the truth buried beneath the carefully curated facade of his generosity. Claire, my sister. The word felt like a shard of glass in my throat. I replayed conversations, her saccharine pronouncements of gratitude, her feigned concern for my own career choices, her casual dismissals of my past financial prudence as overcaution. It was all a performance. Every interaction had been a calculated move in her long game. The loans weren't loans, they were investments. The opportunities weren't opportunities, they were her access points. She'd systematically siphoned her way to her current status, with my father's blessing, or at least his complicity. And my father, the man I'd looked up to, the man whose integrity I'd never questioned, had facilitated it. He'd actively participated in my financial and emotional diminishment. The dollar bill wasn't just a snub, it was the final, bitter punchline to a lifelong deception. I thought about the estate, the sprawling mansion, the manicured lawns, the entire Vance legacy. Claire was already talking about renovations, about making it her own. She was already positioning herself as the inheritor, the rightful queen of their kingdom. And I, the diligent daughter, the dutiful sister, had been relegated to the role of the beggar, the one who got a handout so pathetic it was an insult. The sheer audacity of it all was staggering. This wasn't just about money, it was about power. It was about control. And Claire, with my father's covert assistance, had wielded it with a chilling precision. My mother, I couldn't even begin to process her role in this. Had she known? Had she been a silent observer, a willing participant in this familial drama? Or was she,
like me, a pawn in their elaborate game. Her confusion, her tears, her repeated assertions that Dad loved me, had they been genuine or just another layer of the deception? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. If my mother was aware, if she'd been complicit, then there was truly no one I could trust. I finally stood up, the paper still clutched tightly in my hand. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the room was plunged into twilight. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 6, each chime a solemn pronouncement of my new reality. I wasn't the wrong daughter anymore. I was the one who knew, and knowing changed everything. It wasn't about seeking validation or understanding from them. It wasn't about pleading my case or demanding an explanation. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen, not just the money, but my dignity, my self-worth, my very identity. My mind began to race, not with frantic panic, but with a cold, calculated clarity. I thought about the legal firm, about the contracts, the loopholes, the fine print that governed the world of wealth and inheritance. My father, the shrewd businessman, had left me with the tools, even if he'd intended them for a different purpose. He'd taught me how to dissect a balance sheet, how to identify a fraudulent claim, how to understand the intricate dance of assets and liabilities. He'd armed me, unknowingly, for this very battle. The first step, I decided, was to go back to basics. I needed to understand the full extent of Claire's machinations. The documents in my hand were a start, but they were likely just the tip of the iceberg. I needed financial records, transaction histories, evidence of every single dollar she'd leveraged, every questionable deal she'd brokered. My father's study, once a sanctuary, now felt like an armory. I carefully examined every drawer, every shelf, every hidden compartment. I was looking for anything related to Claire's finances, anything that might shed further light on her empire building. Tucked away in a locked drawer, which I managed to pick using a hairpin and a surprising amount of ingenuity, I found a series of old business journals. They were leather-bound, filled with my father's spidery handwriting. At first, I feared they'd be filled with personal reflections, with more platitudes about family and legacy. But as I flipped through them, a different story emerged. These weren't just journals, they were his personal ledgers, his private accounts, his secret repository of financial wisdom, and, it turned out, his deepest regrets. And there it was, scrawled in the margins of a page dated just a few years ago. Olivia, the steady one, the one who understands value. Claire is a force, a necessary chaos, but I fear I have unleashed something I cannot control. The foundation must be strong. The true inheritance must be protected. Protected from whom? From Claire or from something else entirely?
Further digging revealed more cryptic entries. He'd been setting up trusts, shell corporations, offshore accounts. It wasn't just about leaving Claire money. It was about securing assets, about creating complex financial structures that would, in theory, safeguard wealth. But he'd done it in such a way that Claire, with her insatiable ambition and my father's initial financial backing, had become the architect of her own immense fortune, while I was left with $1. One particular entry, dated about 18 months before his passing, sent a jolt through me. It was a long, detailed account of a meeting with a financial advisor, a man whose name I vaguely recognized from company reports, Arthur Sterling. The entry detailed discussions about liquidity events, asset diversification, and a rather alarming phrase, contingency planning for unforeseen familial challenges. The more I read, the more it became clear that my father hadn't simply been naive. He'd been actively engaged in a complex financial strategy, a strategy that, in its execution, had inadvertently favored Claire to an obscene degree. But there was a new piece of information, a chilling revelation that hadn't been present in the initial folder. My father had also been meticulously documenting Claire's spending habits, not just the large investments, but the extravagant personal expenditures, the designer clothes, the multiple properties, the yachts, the philanthropic donations that seemed more like public relations stunts than genuine charity. He had, it seemed, been tracking her, perhaps even questioning his own choices. He'd even made a note: "The leverage is immense, the risk substantial. I pray she has the acumen to manage it, not just consume it." This wasn't just about my father being manipulated by Claire. It was about my father trying to manage a situation he'd created, a situation that was spiraling out of his control. He'd given Claire the reins, and she'd taken them and galloped away, leaving him to pick up the pieces, or at least to try and secure some remnants of his empire.
And in his attempt to protect the larger Vance legacy, he'd seemingly decided that my strength and independence were the best way to preserve my own future. He'd left me with a theoretical foundation, a challenge, rather than a concrete inheritance. It was a twisted form of paternalism, a belief that struggle would forge me into someone worthy of his legacy, while Claire, the force, the chaos, was to be indulged. The injustice of it all burned. I wasn't just being denied wealth. I was being denied recognition of my own intrinsic value. My father had seen me as a reliable asset, a safe bet, someone who didn't need the boost Claire evidently did. Suddenly, a memory flashed back. A Christmas gathering, 2 years ago. Claire, resplendent in a designer gown, had been boasting about a deal she'd landed. Dad had been beaming, patting her on the back, but I'd caught a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of anxiety, perhaps, or a deep weariness. At the time, I'd dismissed it as the burden of a patriarch overseeing his dynasty. Now it seemed like the look of a man who knew he'd made a terrible mistake and was desperately trying to contain the fallout. I had to know more about Arthur Sterling. He was the linchpin. If my father was engaging in contingency planning, Sterling would have been at the center of it.
I pulled out my phone, my fingers numb, and searched for his name. He was a prominent figure in the financial world, a senior partner at a prestigious wealth management firm. His firm's website featured an article about his expertise in estate planning and complex trust management. This was it. This was where I needed to go. The next few days were a blur of strategic planning. I took an extended leave of absence from the law firm, citing a vague family emergency. My mother called, her voice laced with concern, and I deflected, promising to call her back, a promise I had no intention of keeping. Claire, predictably, was too engrossed in her own life of luxury to notice my absence. She sent a perfunctory text asking if I was okay and if I needed anything, which I ignored. I spent hours online, researching estate law, trust structures, and the history of Vance Industries. I meticulously copied every relevant document from my father's study, creating a digital archive of my own. The dollar bill remained on the desk, a silent witness to the truth I now held. The drive to Arthur Sterling's office was long, winding through affluent suburbs that mocked my current financial state. The building itself was a monument to success, gleaming glass, polished marble, and an air of quiet, unassailable power. I felt ridiculously underdressed, a stark contrast to the impeccably tailored suits and expensive accessories I saw everywhere. When I finally met Arthur Sterling, he was exactly as I'd imagined. Sharp suit, impeccably groomed, with an aura of calm authority. He greeted me with a polite professional smile, his eyes assessing me with a practiced, unreadable gaze. He remembered my father, of course. A titan of industry, he'd said, his voice smooth and practiced. A visionary, and a deeply private man. "Mr. Sterling," I began, my voice surprisingly steady, "I'm here because I believe my father, Robert Vance, may have left some unfinished business, specifically regarding his estate and my sister Claire Vance and myself." I laid out my father's will, the dollar bill, and then, carefully, I introduced the documents I'd found in his study. I presented them not as accusations, but as queries. I spoke about the journals, the cryptic entries, the discussions with him about contingency planning. Sterling listened intently, his expression unreadable. He asked clarifying questions, his legal mind dissecting the information with precision. He confirmed that he had indeed advised Robert Vance on several complex financial strategies. He spoke of Robert's desire to ensure the Vance legacy endured, to protect assets from potential market volatility, and, he hesitated, personal discretion issues. Then I brought up Claire. My father's journals indicate he was concerned about Claire's ambition and her spending. He seemed to be documenting her financial activities and setting up safeguards. Sterling's eyes flickered. Robert was a man who believed in managing risk. He was aware that his daughter had a spirited approach to wealth. He wanted to ensure that while she benefited, the core Vance assets remained stable. This was it, the confirmation. "And the dollar? For me?" I asked, my voice low. Sterling sighed, a barely perceptible sound. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. Robert was unconventional. He believed that true strength came from within, from overcoming obstacles. He felt you possessed that innate resilience, Olivia. He wanted you to build your own foundation, to prove your worth, not through inheritance, but through your own endeavors. He saw it as a test, not a rejection, but a test. The idea was both infuriating and, in a twisted way, validating. My father hadn't hated me. He just had an insane, infuriatingly paternalistic idea of how to prepare me for the world. But what about Claire's inheritance? I pressed. The documents suggest she received substantial financial backing from my father, far more than what was allocated for me. Sterling's gaze became more guarded. Your father's arrangements for Claire were complex. He believed in nurturing her entrepreneurial spirit, as he called it. He provided her with significant capital, believing she would multiply it. And she did. Exceptionally well, in fact. He also established trusts for her, designed to provide her with substantial liquidity, managed under his oversight initially. Initially? I echoed. Yes, Sterling said, leaning forward slightly. As your father's health declined, Mr. Vance made certain decisions. He wanted to ensure a seamless transition of wealth and influence, even in his final days. He delegated significant control over certain Vance assets to Claire, believing she had the drive to maintain and expand them. He trusted her to manage them responsibly, though he confided in me that he had reservations. He paused, choosing his words carefully. There was a particular trust established for Claire that gave her considerable autonomy. It was funded with a significant portion of Mr. Vance's personal holdings. Your father believed that by giving her this control, and by ensuring you had less direct financial support, he was creating a balance, a way to test your mettle, while also empowering her. He often spoke of it as a necessary gamble, a gamble. He'd gambled my future against Claire's ambition, and he'd lost. Or rather, I had lost. But Sterling's words opened a new door. What kind of control? What assets were involved? Sterling hesitated, then opened a secure digital file on his tablet. He began to detail a complex web of corporations, holding companies, and offshore accounts that had been established years ago. My father had been setting up Claire for success, but he'd also been creating a mechanism for her to eventually seize control. He'd essentially gifted her the keys to his kingdom, not by outright inheritance, but by a series of strategic financial maneuvers. And then he revealed something that made my blood run cold. There was a clause in the trust agreement for Claire, Sterling said, his voice grave, a specific provision that allowed her, upon Mr. Vance's permanent incapacitation or death, to assume full signatory authority over a significant portion of the Vance family's liquid assets. This was to be contingent on certain performance metrics, but your father had also included a waiver, allowing her immediate access if he deemed it necessary for the continued growth and protection of the Vance enterprise. He believed, and I concurred, that her aggressive approach, while risky, was the best way to maintain market dominance in certain sectors. The performance metrics were a lie, the waiver a backdoor. My father had been played, or he had willingly set this up, and Claire had exploited it. He had given her the power to drain his own empire. The $2.4 million wasn't just an inheritance. It was a portion of what she controlled, what she had already leveraged, what she had already put into play. And my father, in his final days, had essentially handed her the keys to the entire vault. I looked at Sterling, my eyes burning with a newfound fury. Mr. Sterling, my father's journals also mention you in connection with specific contingency planning for unforeseen familial challenges. What exactly was he planning for? Sterling's gaze was steady, but his jaw was tight. Mr. Vance was concerned. He worried about the potential for disputes over his estate. He was particularly concerned about ensuring a smooth transfer of power and assets, should anything unfortunate happen. He wanted to ensure his wishes were carried out, even if there were disagreements. He clicked on another file. This one contained a series of emails exchanged between him and my father, dating back several years. The tone was increasingly urgent in the later exchanges. Robert, one email from Sterling read, dated about 6 months before my father passed. I must reiterate my concerns regarding the autonomy granted to Claire. The leveraged positions she's taken are aggressive. While the potential for return is significant, the downside risk is equally so. Are we certain this is the optimal strategy for preserving the Vance legacy, or for safeguarding your personal wealth? My father's reply was short, almost defiant. Arthur, you underestimate the Vance name, and you underestimate Claire's drive. She is the future. Olivia is the past. Let her prove her mettle. My blood ran cold. The past. I was the past. My father, in his final act, had not only disinherited me financially, he had systematically erased me from his vision of the future. He had handed my sister the keys to his empire, and in doing so, had declared me obsolete. There's more, Sterling said, his voice barely above a whisper. He opened one final document. It was a power of attorney, signed by my father, granting Claire immediate and absolute control over all Vance Industries accounts, investments, and assets, bypassing all usual probate procedures in the event of his incapacitation or death. It was dated just weeks before his passing.
My father, the man I had idolized, had not just left me $1. He had, in effect, signed away his entire fortune to my sister, and in doing so, had rendered me financially irrelevant. The betrayal was absolute, the humiliation crushing. But beneath the agony, something else was hardening, a resolve, a cold, terrifying clarity. He thought I was the past. He thought I was the one who wouldn't fight. He was wrong. He had given Claire the money, the power, the illusion of victory, but he had also given me the truth. And the truth, as I was learning, was a weapon far more potent than any inheritance. I stood up, the room suddenly feeling too small, too suffocating. Sterling watched me, his expression a mixture of sympathy and professional detachment. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You've been very illuminating." I walked out of that office, not as the victim of a cruel joke, but as a strategist. My father had set me a test, and I intended to pass it. He'd wanted me to build my own foundation. Well, I would. I would build it on the ruins of his deception, on the ashes of his misplaced faith. And Claire.
Claire would learn that the future wasn't just about seizing power, it was about holding on to it. And I, Olivia Vance, the past, was about to make a very unwelcome reappearance. The dollar bill on my father's desk was no longer a symbol of my father's rejection. It was the starting point, the single, solitary seed of my own, carefully cultivated, unstoppable revenge. The game was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The drive back from Arthur Sterling's office was a blur of asphalt and a cold, relentless focus. The air in my car, usually filled with the low hum of my favorite podcast, was thick with the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. The Vance legacy, that grand edifice of wealth and influence, had been built on a foundation of calculated neglect and a profound miscalculation of character. My father, the man I'd revered, had orchestrated my diminishment while fueling Claire's insatiable ambition, believing I was the stable, predictable constant, and she the volatile, necessary force. He'd set us up for a collision, and he'd placed all his chips on the wrong horse. I pulled into my small rented apartment complex, the contrast to the opulent Vance estate stark and almost comical. My father's journals, Sterling's revelations, the stark reality of Claire's financial dominance, it was all a heavy, suffocating burden. But beneath the crushing weight of betrayal, a steely resolve began to solidify. He wanted me to build my own foundation? Fine. I would build it on the bedrock of his lies, brick by painstaking brick. The first step was reconnaissance. Claire was already living the life my father had supposedly earmarked for the entire Vance dynasty, not just her. She was flaunting her success, basking in the glow of the empire my father had essentially handed her the keys to. I needed to understand the scale of her operations, the extent of her control. I started digging, using my legal expertise not for the clients in the firm, but for myself. I delved into public records, corporate filings, property deeds, anything that could shed light on Claire's vast network of assets. It was a labyrinth, designed for obfuscation, but I was a lawyer. I understood how to navigate obfuscation. My father's contingency planning was more than just a vague concern for potential disputes. It was a deeply flawed attempt to control the uncontrollable, to balance the scales he himself had tipped so drastically. Sterling had revealed the power of attorney, the immediate transfer of assets. This wasn't just about Claire inheriting a fortune, it was about her inheriting the control of the entire Vance enterprise, effectively sidestepping any traditional probate or legal scrutiny. My father had gifted her the reins of his legacy, and she had immediately tightened her grip. The dollar bill. It sat on my father's desk, a mocking symbol of my supposed inheritance. But now it felt like a single, perfect seed. A seed that would grow into something far more powerful than any sprawling estate. It represented my father's belief in my resilience, his warped sense of paternalism. He thought it would make me work harder, prove myself. He hadn't accounted for the fact that his son-in-law, Robert Maxwell, was a brilliant financial analyst with a knack for navigating complex markets and a deep-seated resentment towards the Vance name. We had always been a team, Robert and I. Our financial prudence a quiet rebellion against the ostentatious displays of Vance wealth. My father had seen my stability as a virtue. He hadn't seen it as a strength that could be leveraged. I started meeting with Robert, not as a wife seeking comfort, but as a strategist seeking a partner. We spent late nights poring over spreadsheets, financial reports, and the mountain of documents I'd painstakingly gathered. Robert, with his sharp mind for numbers and his inherent distrust of the Vance brand of wealth, was a revelation. He saw the loopholes, the leverage points, the vulnerabilities in Claire's meticulously crafted financial empire. He pointed out how the investments my father had funded were heavily leveraged, dependent on continued market growth and Claire's own, often impulsive decisions. "She's playing with fire, Liv," Robert had said, his brow furrowed as he scrolled through a report on her latest acquisition. "Your dad gave her the matches, the fuel, and the accelerant, all in one neat package, but he didn't give her the fire extinguisher. And those trusts he set up for her, they're designed to keep her afloat, but they're also incredibly dependent on the underlying performance of Vance Industries. If that falters..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. Claire's empire, built on my father's indulgence and her own audacity, was a house of cards. And my father's notion of contingency planning was in essence an admission that he knew this. He'd seen the potential for disaster, but instead of averting it, he decided to appoint a successor he believed could manage the chaos, while simultaneously testing me with a symbolic rejection. The next phase was subtle, a creeping tendril of influence. We didn't confront Claire. Not yet. That would be too messy, too direct. Instead, we began to work from the shadows. Robert, using his connections and his reputation for discretion, started to subtly position himself as a potential advisor to Vance Industries' other key stakeholders. He'd always been quiet about his own financial successes, preferring to let his results speak for themselves. Now he began to make his presence felt, not as a rival, but as a stabilizing force. He'd highlight market trends, subtly point out overextensions, and offer alternative, more conservative investment strategies to individuals and entities that had significant dealings with Vance Industries. It was a slow burn. I watched Claire from a distance, observing her social media, her public appearances. She was still on top of the world, oblivious. She still believed she had won. Her father had died, and the spoils were hers. The dollar bill, a supposed insult, had been the only tangible piece of her inheritance I'd received. She'd probably forgotten about it by now, lost in the dizzying heights of her self-made success. The first cracks appeared around the holiday season. It was Thanksgiving. The usual Vance family gathering at the sprawling estate felt like a distant, almost alien memory. Instead, I found myself at a small, intimate dinner with Robert's parents, warm and genuine people who had always treated me like one of their own. I didn't miss the Vance fanfare. I didn't miss the forced smiles and the unspoken rivalries. Then the news started to trickle in, distorted at first, like whispers in a crowded room. A key investor pulling out of a major Vance Industries deal. A significant drop in the stock price of one of Claire's holding companies. Rumors of financial impropriety, of aggressive accounting practices that were starting to draw scrutiny. It was all coming to a head, faster than even Robert had anticipated. Claire, accustomed to unchallenged authority, was floundering. Her father's guidance, however flawed, had been a crutch. Without it, her impulsive decisions and her hunger for more were starting to backfire. She'd been so focused on expansion, on leveraging every available asset, that she hadn't built a solid foundation. She was like a gambler who kept doubling down, convinced her luck would never run out. The true power shift, however, was not in the market's reaction, but in the subtle shift of alliances. People who had once flocked to Claire, eager to bask in the reflected glory of Vance Industries, began to distance themselves. Her father's carefully cultivated network, the network that had once been her launchpad, was now a fragile ecosystem, and its inhabitants were starting to sense the impending storm. Robert, meanwhile, was quietly building his own network. He wasn't playing the Vance game of overt displays of wealth or power. He was building trust, demonstrating competence, and offering a steady hand in turbulent times. He started receiving calls from former Vance associates, from people who remembered my father's cautious approach, his appreciation for true value over flashy spectacle. They remembered me, too, the Olivia who was diligent, ethical, and always saw the long game. The inevitable confrontation came not with fireworks, but with a chilling, profound silence. It was a few months after Thanksgiving. Claire, looking drawn and stressed, her usual immaculate appearance slightly frayed, called me. She didn't ask about my life, my well-being. She didn't apologize for any past slights. She was in crisis. "Olivia," she began, her voice tight, "I need your help. Things are complicated at Vance Industries. Dad's arrangements, they're not as straightforward as I thought. I need someone who understands the legal side of things,
someone I can trust. The irony was almost unbearable. She, who had reveled in my father's rejection of me, was now coming to me for salvation. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling, and she was desperate. I agreed to meet her at a neutral location, a quiet cafe downtown, far from the opulence of our childhood home. As she sat across from me, the carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes. She laid out the situation in a torrent of words: dwindling capital, mounting debts, angry creditors, and the looming threat of regulatory investigations. Dad's power of attorney, she confessed, her voice cracking. It gave me control, yes, but it also gave him the ability to have oversight. And now that he's gone, those loopholes, they're being exploited by everyone. They know the structure is unstable. They know the legacy is vulnerable. She looked at me, her gaze pleading, desperate. He always said you were the steady one, the responsible one. He said you understood value. He told me you'd always be there. The words stung, not because they were untrue, but because of the context. My father had called me steady and responsible to justify his disinheritance. He'd seen my inherent nature not as a strength, but as a reason to marginalize me. "And what did you do with my father's money, Claire?" I asked, my voice quiet, deceptively calm. She flinched. I invested it. I grew it, just like Dad wanted. He wanted the Vance name to be synonymous with unstoppable growth. Unstoppable growth or unsustainable leverage, I countered, leaning forward slightly. My father's journals, Mr. Sterling's revelations, they painted a different picture, Claire. They painted a picture of a man who knew he was gambling with his legacy and who ultimately decided to bet it all on you. Her eyes widened, a flicker of panic in their depths. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that my father didn't just give you control of Vance Industries. He gave you the power to drain it. He gave you the keys to every account, every investment, and then he put me aside, deeming me the past, while you were the future. He set you up to succeed, yes, but he also set you up to fail spectacularly if you couldn't handle it. I watched her face crumble, the facade of superiority dissolving to reveal the terrified woman beneath. He never said— No, he didn't, I agreed. He left that for me to discover. He left me with $1, Claire, and the truth. And the truth, as it turns out, is a far more powerful inheritance than you ever imagined. I pulled out my phone. It was time. I had spent weeks meticulously documenting every one of Claire's questionable transactions, every leveraged investment, every potential violation. Robert and I had packaged it all, not as an accusation, but as a meticulously researched report, a comprehensive overview of the precarious financial state of Vance Industries under Claire's leadership. "I've prepared a report," I said, sliding my phone across the table. "It details the current exposure of Vance Industries, the risks associated with your current investment strategies, and the potential legal ramifications of your ambitious financial management." Claire stared at the screen, her face paling with every swipe. She recognized the data, the analysis. She recognized the cold, hard facts that confirmed her deepest fears. This can't be," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It is," I said, my gaze steady. "My father believed I was the past. He believed I would fade away. But he underestimated my strength, just as he underestimated the fragility of the empire he built. He taught me how to dissect a financial statement, how to identify a risk, how to understand the true meaning of value. He arms me with knowledge, even if he didn't intend for me to use it against his chosen heir." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "You came to me for help, Claire, and I will help you, but not in the way you expect. I'm not here to bail you out. I'm here to ensure the Vance legacy, the one my father so painstakingly and so misguidedly tried to protect, doesn't completely disintegrate. And that means taking control." Her eyes, wide with disbelief and dawning horror, locked onto mine. "You can't. Dad gave me everything. He gave you the illusion of everything," I corrected gently. "He gave you the leverage, the capital, the power. But he also gave me the knowledge to understand its limits. And now, with the support of key stakeholders who have come to trust my judgment, people who remember my father's integrity more than your exuberance, I'm in a position to restructure Vance Industries, to make it stable, to make it sustainable." It was a quiet coup. No shouting matches, no dramatic scenes in a boardroom,
Just the cold, hard reality of financial collapse, meeting the quiet, determined strength of someone who had been underestimated one too many times. Claire, facing ruin and regulatory scrutiny, had no choice. Her father's legacy was teetering on the brink, and her own ambition had brought it there. She was stripped of her authority, her assets frozen, and Vance Industries placed under a new, carefully constructed leadership team, with Robert and I at its helm. The estate, the mansion, the sprawling grounds, it was all part of the restructuring. It would be managed, its value preserved, not as a trophy for Claire, but as a symbol of resilience and a reminder of the true meaning of wealth. Claire, humbled and stripped of her ill-gotten gains, was offered a modest stipend, a path to rebuild her life, far from the dizzying heights she had so recklessly pursued. She accepted, a broken woman, acknowledging the magnitude of her own downfall. My mother, she cried. She cried for the lost inheritance, for the fractured family, for the man she had loved and lost, and for the man he had become in his final years. I held her, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding. Her tears were for the dream of a united family, a dream that had been shattered by my father's flawed vision. The dollar bill was long gone from my father's desk. It sat on my own dresser now, not as a symbol of rejection, but as a reminder of the beginning of my own journey, the journey my father had inadvertently set me on. I hadn't sought revenge, not in the destructive, vindictive sense. I had sought justice. I had sought to reclaim my own worth, my own dignity, and to ensure that my father's legacy, however tarnished, was not entirely consumed by the fire of unchecked ambition. The game was over. I had played it with every ounce of my strength, my intellect, and my resolve, and I had won, not with a triumphant roar, but with a silent, profound exhale. The weight that had settled on my shoulders for so long finally lifted, replaced by something new, the quiet, undeniable power of having rebuilt my life, brick by painstaking brick, on the ashes of betrayal. The Vance legacy was safe, not in Claire's hands, but in mine, and as I looked out at the world, no longer defined by my father's judgment, but by my own hard-won victory, I knew that this was just the beginning. This was my foundation. This was my inheritance, and it was worth more than all the money in the world.